Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of history's absolute biggest paradoxes. You know those religious boundaries you see on a map today? The deep cultural and theological split between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East? Well, they didn't just happen by accident. They're the direct, lingering fallout of the story we're about to dive into. Think about it. How exactly did a tiny, fiercely persecuted sect morph into a massive state religion? And ironically, how did the Roman Empire's relentless obsession with universal religious unity actually trigger the permanent fractures that literally shaped our modern world? Let's get into it. To wrap our heads around this massive millennium-spanning shift, we'll start with from persecution to power, then move into defining the Roman faith, followed by the first great fractures. After that, we'll look at how empires rise and fall, and wrap up with the lasting legacy. It's a structured journey through some seriously dense geopolitical and theological shifts, so let's jump right in. Section 1. From persecution to power and the rise of a new faith. So early on, Christians flat out refused to participate in the Roman imperial cult. Basically, they wouldn't pledge allegiance to the emperor as a living god. And in Rome, that was seen as straight-up treason. This led to some incredibly brutal persecution. I mean, when the Great Fire of Rome destroyed the city in 64 AD, Emperor Nero famously used this tiny sect as a really convenient scapegoat. But, the momentum slowly started to shift. By 98 AD, Emperor Nerva granted them tax exemptions. This was huge because it provided crucial legal recognition, effectively separating Christians from Judaism in the eyes of the Roman state. Then we see a massive geopolitical leap in 301 AD, when the Kingdom of Armenia actually adopted it as their official state religion. The real tipping point for Rome itself, though, hit just a bit later. The Edict of Serdica in 311 officially ended the state-sponsored persecution, and literally 2 years later, the Edict of Milan in 313 granted full legal tolerance across the whole empire. Just like that, the faith stepped out of the shadows and right into the halls of power.
By 350 AD, we're looking at a massive demographic shift. Sociologist Rodney Stark estimates that Christians grew from this marginalized, underground minority to making up over 56.5% of the entire Roman population. I mean, that is a staggering, explosive expansion for the ancient world. Over half the empire. So how exactly does a sprawling superpower flip its entire worldview and allegiance in just a couple of centuries?
Well, the reality is, Christianity offered an incredibly attractive doctrine that just addressed everyday human needs way better than its pagan rivals did. Traditional Roman religion was frankly super transactional. You sacrifice to the gods so they don't destroy your crops. But this new faith, it emphasized profound community support. For example, during those devastating plagues that would periodically sweep through the empire, wealthy elites and pagan priests would literally flee the cities. But Christians were actually known to stay behind and nurse the sick. That level of ground floor charity built immense loyalty. It gave people a deeply meaningful alternative to the rigid, kind of impersonal imperial cult. And because of that, the idea spread like wildfire. It took incredibly strong root in the heavily populated eastern parts of the empire and in dense urban centers. It wasn't just a religion anymore, right? It had become this unstoppable cultural movement. Section 2. Defining the Roman faith and the quest for orthodoxy. As the church grew to this massive scale, bringing in people from Britain all the way to Syria, a totally new problem popped up. What exactly were all these vastly different people supposed to believe? The answer they were looking for was orthodoxy, which just means the correct religious doctrines. But here's the catch. In the 4th century, defining this wasn't just some quiet theological exercise for scholars to debate. It became a high-stakes game of imperial politics. You see, traditional Roman emperors had always held the title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest. They expected religious unity because, to them, unity guaranteed political stability. So, the emperors themselves started stepping in. They began convening massive councils of bishops and literally demanding that they hammer out an official, state-sanctioned definition of the Christian faith. Theology basically turned into a political battleground, and the consequences were massive. Take the really intense 4th century debate over the precise nature of Christ. On one side, you had the Nicene view, which vigorously argued that the Father and the Son are of the exact same substance. Pitted right against this was the Arian view, arguing they are similar, sure, but the Father is inherently greater. Now, this might sound like total hair-splitting to us today, but back in the Roman Empire, people were literally rioting in the streets over this distinction. Why? Because once the state picked a winning side, disagreeing on these philosophical points suddenly meant you weren't just arguing with your local bishop anymore. You were directly defying the Roman emperor. And by 380 AD, the state really brought the hammer down.
In the sweeping Edict of Thessalonica, Emperors Theodosius I, Gratian, and Valentinian II made their stance absolutely clear. The decree stated, and I quote, "We decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics, and shall not presume to give to their conventicles the name of churches, since in our judgment they are foolish madmen." Wow. With those forceful words, Nicene Christianity became the one and only official state religion of the Roman Empire. Conformity wasn't a polite request anymore. It was the law of the land.
Section 3. The First Great Fractures and the Irony of a Universal Church. So, what inevitably happens when a sprawling, heavily diverse state tries to force-feed a single, rigid truth? Fracture. It's bound to happen. In the 5th century, completely new debates erupted over Christ's nature. You had Nestorianism, which argued that Christ's divine and human nature are distinct persons. Then you had Miaphysitism, which argued that Christ has only a single, unified nature. For the average citizen living in places like Egypt or Syria, this wasn't just some abstract theology. It was heavily tied to their local, cultural identity, pushing back against the demands of a really oppressive imperial capital in Constantinople. Resisting the emperor's theology became a form of regional rebellion. So when imperial councils tried to crush these views to force unity, they actually ended up permanently alienating massive factions of the church instead. This theological splintering rewrote the map pretty much overnight. By the mid-5th century, this supposedly universal church was fundamentally shattered. The Chalcedonian, or imperial church, managed to hold on to traditional state-backed centers like Rome and Constantinople. But the Nestorians, who were fleeing state persecution, went off and formed the flourishing Persian church, spreading aggressively across Syria, India, and incredibly, all the way to China. Meanwhile, Miaphysitism took really deep, permanent roots in independent-minded regions, forming the Armenian, Coptic, and Syriac churches. It's a wild irony, right? The relentless imperial pursuit of a single, unified church actually ended up physically shattering it across the known world. Actually, there's this fascinating linguistic detail that perfectly captures the mood on the ground at the time. The term Melkites. It comes from the Syriac word Malka, which means imperial or king. This was basically a derogatory term used by the seceding Oriental Orthodox churches to describe the Christians who stuck with the imperially recognized Chalcedonian church. It's such brilliant proof of how theological lines were inextricably tied to imperial loyalty. Basically, if you agreed with the official state council, you were just seen as the emperor's pawn. It's a really powerful reminder of how language gets weaponized in these political and religious conflicts. Section 4. Empires Rise and Fall. Shifting Borders, Shifting Faiths. Geopolitical turbulence was about to reshape everything we just talked about. In 476 AD, the entire Western Roman Empire completely collapses under the weight of invasions and internal decay, totally leaving Rome without an emperor. Fast forward a bit to 533 AD, and the Eastern Emperor Justinian launches these massive, hugely expensive campaigns to violently reclaim the lost West. But that stability, very short-lived. By 634 AD, the weakened empire suddenly clashes with the stunningly rapid expansion of Islam, losing massive, historically wealthy territories in the Middle East and North Africa. So, reacting to these shifting loyalties and the need for defense, Emperor Leo III does something drastic in 740 AD. He physically transfers key church territories in the Balkans and southern Italy away from the Pope in Rome, just handing them straight over to the Patriarch of Constantinople. The political map was being violently redrawn decade by decade, and the church's administrative structure was just getting dragged right along with it. Right in the middle of all this chaos, Emperor Justinian I fiercely cemented a concept known as Caesaropapism. This is essentially the emperor's claimed right and his solemn duty to regulate the absolute minutest details of worship and to formally dictate theological opinions in the church. Take a second to think about how radical that sounds to us today. We're so used to the separation of church and state, right? Well, in the Byzantine East, there literally was no separation. The state wasn't just supporting the church, it completely and unabashedly controlled the entire apparatus. To manage this sprawling religious empire, Justinian organized the church around the Pantharchy. These were 5 supreme administrative centers: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. But, as we know, history intervened. When Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem were quickly absorbed by the massive Islamic conquests, who was left standing? Just Rome and Constantinople. They were the only major independent powers left in the Christian world. The 5 pillars were suddenly reduced to 2, completely setting the stage for an epic, inevitable power struggle between the Latin West and the Greek East. Section 5. The lasting legacy, a house divided. Let's trace the final, dramatic milestones that made this split permanent. In 751 AD, the Exarchate of Ravenna ends. This is a crucial moment because it means the Pope in Rome is suddenly utterly devoid of Byzantine military protection against local invaders. Desperate for a new champion, the Pope makes a truly shocking geopolitical move. He crowns the Frankish king Charlemagne as the new Roman emperor in 800 AD. Honestly, this was a massive slap in the face to the actual Roman emperor sitting over in Constantinople. This deeply rooted political separation slowly boiled over until it spiritually culminated in 1054 AD with the Great East-West Schism, which was the dramatic mutual excommunication of the leaders of Rome and Constantinople. Finally, in 1453 AD, the legendary walls of Constantinople fall to the Ottomans, completely ending the Byzantine Empire and leaving the Eastern Church to survive without its emperor. This whole timeline resulted in two drastically different ideologies. Over in Western Europe, the total collapse of the Roman state actually fostered the idea of a universal church operating completely free from any particular state government. In a lot of ways, membership in the Catholic Church actually replaced Roman citizenship as the primary unifying identity of Europe. But in Eastern Europe, the Byzantine view held firm. The Church and the Empire were completely inseparable. To them, a perfect world order meant one universal empire, logically equaling one universal church. These deeply ingrained psychological differences about church and state authority, they still define a massive amount of the cultural divide between Western and Eastern Europe even today. To understand just how deep this Eastern ideology really went, look at this. In 1393, literally just decades before the Byzantine Empire was totally destroyed, Patriarch Anthony IV resolutely declared, "It is not possible among Christians to have a church and not to have an emperor. For the empire and the church have great unity and commonality, and it is not possible to separate them." It's incredible. Even as their territory had shrunk down to basically a single city, the Eastern Church had entirely psychologically merged with the very concept of the Roman emperor. Which brings us to our final provocative thought. Did the pursuit of one universal Roman church ultimately guarantee its division? By desperately trying to force a single, state-mandated orthodoxy on a deeply diverse world, the empire forged theological and political fractures that long outlasted the empire itself. It directly shapes the Catholic and Orthodox churches we know today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer as we unpacked this massive historical legacy. Keep exploring, and I'll catch you next time.